We're going to move from the focus of the article portion of the worksheet to the variables section, so we're skipping ahead a bit. I organized the worksheet in the order of the information is included in the article, but the textbook talks about the topics in a little different order, and I decided to follow the sequence of the textbook while we're initially learning about the concepts. I called this segment Variables in Real Studies because reading about it in the textbook can make it seem a little more simple than it really is in real life, and at the same time, make it seem more complicated, which seems contradictory, but I hope it makes a little sense. As you might remember from the resources about variables, a variable can be any event, situation, behavior, or individual characteristic that has at least two values. In research, we talk about each variable in two ways. Sometimes we use more general labels that fit with the conceptual or construct definition. And other times, we talk about the specific way the variable is defined for the research, also known as the operational definition. Generally, the introduction to discussion sections are more likely to use the conceptual label, and the method and the result section are more likely to refer to the operational definition. It means we can usually identify the general variables when we determine the focus of the article. We also want to note the operational definition, though, to understand what the authors mean when they use those labels. The heading for this section of the worksheet helps you remember what information we will, ideally, include for three different types of variables. If a study includes a measured variable that isn't self-report or physiological, we'll record as much information as we think is necessary to prompt our memory later. At this point, you might be wondering why we would want to note or copy all of the details I include on this worksheet. There are three reasons. One reason is because we're looking at examples of the different types of operational definitions, and looking at those details not only helps illustrate the differences between the general categories of self-report, physiological, behavioral, manipulated, but also demonstrates the range of ways those types of variables are actually used in research. The operational definitions help us understand what the authors really mean when they talk about the variables, so we know if they're talking about what we think they're talking about. If there's a citation, it also lets us know there's been a lot of work done to make sure the measure is reliable and valid, so the citation signals that it's a credible measure. The other reason we make note of these details is because the notes can help us later when we design a study. If we want to study a variable that was also included in another study, we can go back and see how they operationalized it. If it was a self-report measure, having the citation in our worksheet notes can help us see if we can use the measure for our study. If you haven't already done so, please pause this recording to open your files for the Burton and King article, the PDF of the article itself, and the Word file with the worksheet. I highlighted the variables in the Burton and King study when we identified the focus, in part to help us start thinking about how the different parts of the worksheet relate to one another. When you're looking at your notes about the focus of a study, it's helpful to know that the focus is usually talking about two things: the variable in a study and what influences the value of that variable. We just have to figure out which parts we think are what will vary and which parts are describing how they will vary. Burton and King make it a little trickier by talking about different levels of the variables and using slightly different wording in the goal sentence compared to the prediction. If we think about the wording and what they appear to be interested in, though, we get the idea that they're interested in three variables: writing, mood, and health. We can start our notes in the variables and operational definition section of the worksheet by adding those simple conceptual labels. Then, we look for the operational definitions to know specifically how they defined each variable. We know that we're looking for information about writing, mood, and health. Knowing about APA style also helps us know where to look. The information about operational definitions should be in the methods section. Skimming this section, the first variable we see is mood. We can use the highlighted information to summarize the operational definition. Your notes on the article summary template should include at least the information included in the example in this slide. Note that the summary template includes a note about recording the citation, if it's available. This is an example of where a citation isn't included, so we can assume the authors developed the measure for this study. We still have two more variables, so we'll continue skimming the methods section. In the procedures section, we find the first mention of the writing manipulation, where we learn that they operationalized it in terms of writing for 20 minutes a day for 3 consecutive days. The header Writing Instructions below the procedures signals that we'll find more information about the operational definition of writing. The explanation actually started a little before that, though, in the procedures section, as I mentioned in the last slide. I hope that the phrases participants read the following instructions and experimental condition help signal that the writing variable was manipulated. For the article summary, we can summarize the operational definition like I have in this slide. We know that health was the other variable of interest. If we continue reading, we can find the operational definition for that variable in the last paragraph of the writing instruction section, although it doesn't really fit with that heading. We can use the highlighted information to summarize the operational definition. This slide includes an example of what this section of the worksheet might look like. Notice that I added whether the variable was measured or manipulated along with the general variable name. That'll help when I think about the research design later. The information about the mood measure doesn't include all of the information we hope to have for self-report measure because the article didn't include it all. There wasn't a citation. The information about the alpha is the reliability and validity information. Notice, too, that a lot of the information is copied and pasted from the article, but I edited it and formatted it to make it easier to understand when I look at my notes later. If you haven't already done so, make sure to add your notes to the corresponding sections of the article summary template before moving on. If it seems tricky to determine if a variable was manipulated, you might try asking yourself 2 questions. First, did the researchers influence what participants did or when they did it? If not, it's not a manipulated variable. If they did, we need to ask whether the researchers had different groups of participants do different things. If they did, it fit the characteristics of a manipulated variable, otherwise known as an independent variable. If they had all participants do the same thing, then there'd only be one value for the variable, so it wouldn't actually be a variable in the study. It'd be a control, or context. For example, one of the studies you might summarize for one of the activities focuses on the relationship between stress, social support, and health. They operationalized health by exposing all participants to a virus and measuring the level of infection. Since all of the participants are exposed to the same level of the virus, it isn't a study variable. The Hearst article is an example of a very different type of operational definition. If you haven't already opened the Hearst article and worksheet, please pause the recording and do that before moving on. When we start by looking at the focus of the article, we see another variation on how they talk about the variables. In this case, they focus on what they plan to do and why. We can identify the variables by asking ourselves what they thought would vary. The phrase, synthesize the qualitative research, is what they plan to do. The phrase, in order to identify, signals they're talking about why they will do it. When we ask, what did they think will vary, we might note that the words trend, which suggests change. Since change suggests different values, and they use the word in reference to college student stressors, we can tentatively say that college student stressors is a variable in the study. The other part of the purpose that we haven't accounted for is the cognitive appraisals of stressors. Since they refer to cognitive appraisals to explain why they're looking at college student stressors, though, they don't seem to be influencing the variations, so it doesn't seem to be a variable. But it might be, so I'm going to make a note to look for more information to decide for sure. While the Hearst article is different because it's analysis of other studies, we're still looking for the same information, an explanation of how they defined the variable. In other words, how did they determine whether an article included information about the variable or the variables? In APA style, we know information about how the variables are defined is usually in the methods section, so we can start by looking there. That section doesn't have the usual subsections we're used to, but we know that sections should include information about how the variables were defined, so we can start skimming to see if we find any phrases that seem to be talking about how they decided about whether an article included information about the variables they were interested in. One of the first things we see is that they looked for articles published between 2000 and 2012, which would be part of the way they defined the variable. They also mentioned the databases and search terms, but since that was more of a general step, I didn't include it in my notes. Doesn't hurt though if you want to include it in yours. If we keep skimming, we find the phrase, to be included in the current study, which helps signal that they're starting to explain the specific details they used to define whether an article was about college student stressors. That paragraph explains the criteria and how they determined the reliability among the coders. In other words, it explains what researchers looked at to decide if an article was about college student stress, and how frequently 2 or more coders agreed that the article was about stress. This is a good example of a situation where it's more helpful to note the main ideas from the method rather than copying and pasting everything. For example, it's less important to include the specific notes about why articles were excluded. That said, you might have noticed I didn't have anything highlighted that appears to relate to cognitive appraisal. They didn't mention that in the method, so it wasn't a variable, and it shouldn't be included in the notes about variables and operational definitions. Here's an example of how I summarize the information about how they defined student stressors in this article. Now that you've learned about the process and seen my model, use the PDF file of the Hearst article to complete the variables section of that worksheet. Then, look at Schifrin and Nelson. It's a quantitative article, so you can use the same strategies we learned about for the Burton and King article. As we mentioned when we looked at the focus of the article, Schifrin and Nelson were interested in two variables, stress and happiness. If we weren't sure if the variables were measured or manipulated, the headings in the measures section helped us check our thinking. Then, the description of the measures included all of the information we hoped to find. You might notice that I moved the citation right after the name of the measure. I did that because those are the two pieces of information I'd need if I wanted to find more information about the measure, so it helps to have them back to back in my notes. I also reformatted the information, so it was more of a list than a narrative to make it easier to see the important details. One of the reasons I selected the three articles we're using for the example activity is because they represent a few important ideas about variables. One of those ideas is that starting with the purpose, hypothesis, and other information about the author's purpose helps us know what we're looking for in the method. That's helpful because the information about the variables can be presented in several different ways. Authors don't always present measures consistently within an article, let alone across articles, so it's helpful to skim the entire method section. These articles also provide examples of different approaches to operational definitions, from a simple one-question questionnaire one questionnaire measure to a qualitative analysis, from a manipulated variable to a combination of 3 questionnaires for one variable. They also presented examples of the minimum amount of information that should be included about an operational definition and of what we hope to see in the ideal.